Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session on opportunities for on-site biosecurity practices. I'm Dr. Megan Niederwarder, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Swine Health Information Center. Thank you for coming to this session, and I just want to express gratitude to the organizers of the conference. The Swine Health Information Center is certainly grateful to be a part of designing and helping to provide input into the organization of the conference, the topics, and certainly biosecurity on site and transport biosecurity has been a big effort of the Swine Health Information Center over the last several years, and one in which you'll hear some outcomes of that program here today. We funded the Wean to Harvest Biosecurity Research Program in 2022, and then we funded over 24 projects so far in that program. Initially, we had $2.3 million of allocated funds towards that with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Pork Checkoff. And because we had so many great projects proposed through that program, we actually went above that budget. And so we've had a total of $2.5 million invested in the Wean to Harvest Biosecurity Research Program. This includes on-site biosecurity, which you'll hear some of the outcomes here today. And then we also have a transport biosecurity session that the Swine Health Information Center is sponsoring tomorrow. So look forward to your participation there as well. And we will go ahead and get started. We have 3 presentations for you today, again, focused on opportunities for on-site biosecurity. The first one is from Dr. Igor Paploski, and it is entitled Environmental Contamination in Dead Boxes and Composting Bins of Wean-to-Finish Farms. Dr. Paploski is an assistant professor at the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine here at the University of Minnesota. His interests are in the epidemiology of infectious diseases of swine, such as PRRS, PEDV, and others, as well as evaluating biosecurity opportunities and preventative strategies to reduce burden of disease on farms. So welcome, Dr. Paploski.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words, thank you for the kind introduction. It's always a little bit challenging when I am the first person presenting on a session because I like to speak. So I always feel like I end up derailing the session a little bit, which is exactly what I'm doing now. So I apologize. Let me get to it. So Dr. Megan Niederwarder introduced my presentation. Even though I am the one doing this presentation right now, this is actually a work of a student of mine, Rafael Medeiros. He's sitting on the second row over here. I will mention him throughout the presentation. All of these results, all of the data that you're seeing, this is his effort, this is his work, this is his master's project. So a little bit on the team and financial support. So again, this is Rafael, I just mentioned. There are other key people in this project. Kimberly van der Wal, which is sitting over there. Cesar Corzo, which I don't see here, but he's around. Mariana Kikuchi and Amanda Vzorek, which is another member of my group. I cannot proceed on this presentation without thanking SHIC for the support for this. This project is entirely funded by SHIC. If it wasn't for SHIC, this would not have been a thing. So if you are a producer and you're paying money to SHIC, I would like to extend my appreciation to you guys because my work is only possible because of you. And also to the Swine Disease Eradication Center, which also gave a little bit of money to help on certain aspects of this project. So dealing with dead animals is part of the process of raising livestock. You're gonna raise animals, some of them are gonna die. It is what it is. But it is necessary for us to handle these animals appropriately because part of the reason why some of these animals are dying is because of infectious diseases. And if we want to prevent infectious diseases from occurring on these farms, or at least minimize the impact that they have, how we handle these dead animals is important because it may matter for disease spread. Perhaps not necessarily on the farm, although one might argue that it might, but at least on the spread to other farms. PRRS alone is known to be very, very costly to the American swine industry. $1.2 billion in the US alone every year are losses caused by PRRS. This is data from this year, 2025. And again, handling dead animal carcasses is crucial to prevent disease spread under this context. So how are dead animals handled in swine farms? At least here in the Midwest, there are 2 main ways in which dead animals are handled. This is an illustration of a mock swine farm, some barns. This particular illustration contains 2 structures that I want to point out. The dead box, which is essentially a structure where these dead animals are carried to be picked up by usually rendering trucks, and composting bins, which are structures in which animals are carried to and they are mixed with carbon sources for them to compost over time. A farm will not have both structures at the same time, but here just to illustrate what they look like, right? So this is what a composting bin looks like. You add the carcasses and carbon source, you mix them up every few weeks. Over the course of a few months, you end up with dirt, essentially, that if the process is well done, is hopefully negative for all pathogens. That box looks sometimes like this, sometimes a little bit different than this, but it is essentially a structure where animals are deposited, and once every 2-3 days, a truck shows up, pick up the animals, takes them away for rendering. Last year I presented on Leman, and I presented a work that I did in which I was able to find that a significant fraction of PRRS outbreaks could be attributed to rendering. And I like to bring that slide because I think the message is quite impactful. So what I was doing was I was assessing the attributable fraction of incidents of PRRS that could be attributed to different risk factors. So the farm being located in a high density county, being a large farm, having above a certain threshold of animals, the farm being not filtered, storing feces or manure in lagoons versus pits, and if the farm does rendering or not. And the risk associated with rendering was not the greatest one, but it is one of the few among these that we can actually intervene. I cannot move my farm. High density county, what am I going to do? Am I going to fly my farm away? I can't do that. Large farm, am I going to be okay having unused space on my farm? No. Manuring lagoon, well, that's expensive. Maybe filtering, you can discuss about that, but how you handle that animals is something that is relatively easy to change. So I found when I did this analysis that 2% on an average farm, 2% of the PRRS outbreaks could be attributed to the farm doing rendering. Wow, 2%. You're going to convince me that this matters. Here's the thing. 2% was when I was looking at across all of the farms. When I stratified these according to systems, certain systems, they do more rendering than others. And then when I did that, I found that in certain systems, this attributable fraction of PRRS incidents being attributed to rendering could be as high as 20%, 19%. So there are some systems in which doing rendering matters more. So because of that, we decided to do a study assessing the environmental contamination in and around dead boxes and composting bins of these wean-to-finish farms. So the objective of this study was to assess the presence of PRRS, PED, and PDCOV in environmental samples collected from compost bins and dead boxes on positive wean-to-finish farms. And why positive is, I'm going to spend a little bit more time discussing that in the future, but just keep that in mind. All of the farms that we visited were positive to some disease. There are other objectives on this study. We haven't finished this study yet, so what I'm presenting here today is a small piece of the puzzle. Hopefully in the next few months, 2-3 months, we might have more, but Leman will be done by then, so it is what it is. The hypothesis that we have is that environmental contamination around carcass disposal sites differs depending on the method of dead animal management. So depending on how the farm chooses to handle their dead animals, we're going to see, our hypothesis that we're going to see different levels of contamination. So those photos are photos from Google Maps. Those are not mine. Shows the photo of a rendering truck picking up dead pigs on a farm and of a composting bin. What we did is we visited 40 wean-to-finish farms known to be positive for either PRRS or PDEV. Our criteria of inclusion we asked them, hey, are you positive to either PRRS or PDEV? Among the composting sites, all of them were positive for PRRS, and among the rendering sites, most of them, 90% of them were positive for PRRS, and 20% of them were positive for PEDV. If you sum those two numbers, they don't sum up to 20. That's because, well, there were farms that were positive for both diseases. But that's our inclusion criteria. So we try to make our inclusion criteria as similar as possible. We did the same effort into, are you positive for PRRS or PED? Yes, okay, I'd like to do this, 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 and that, regardless of if the farm was doing rendering or composting. We collected 400 samples, 10 on each farm. So from each farm, we went to the wall of the structure, which is shown here in red, and I tried to make a star that is red colored on these two images, trying to display where is on these structures that we collected what we call the wall sample. We collected samples from the ground, so from here and here, from the road, which is a little bit further away from the structure itself, closer to where vehicles are driving, so here and there, from the carcasses itself, if we were able to find them, and from leachates of these structures, if we were able to find them. we visited, well, Rafael visited these farms and he collected samples from these structures, these places, these locations and these structures, and the collection of these samples involved him dressing up using a Tyvek suit and plastic boots, and then he was using a mop, a Swiffer mop, to essentially rub, you know, these structures on those particular locations to collect samples to be tested later. As soon as he was finished collecting one of the samples, he would remove the Swiffer mop from the Swiffer tool, and he would put that inside of a Ziploc bag with transport media. He would transport all of the samples that he collected in a single day to the University of Minnesota on that day, and then no more than 24 hours, he would process the samples, which involved essentially him squeezing these samples out, getting the liquid from the sample, then we had transport media on it, and putting that into Eppendorf tubes. These Eppendorf tubes were then sent to be tested for PRRS, PEDV, and PEDCOV. For each farm, the 3 lowest CT samples that we got, regardless of the sample type, we sent those for viral isolation. I will let you know in advance that we didn't get any viral isolates from this. So we did that, but we were not successful in getting viral isolates. So going to results. So the environment in rendering farms was more often contaminated, and contaminated with more viruses. So what I used to illustrate that is that the environment in 80% of the rendering farms that we sampled was positive for at least one of the viruses that we were testing. Contrast that with 30% of the environment around composting farms being positive for at least one of these viruses. So this proportion is quite distinct depending on if the farm is processing animals through rendering or composting. This plot over here shows the CT that we got stratified by the way that they're processing the dead animals, either composting or rendering, for the different diseases. So 36% of all of the samples from rendering sites tested positive for at least one virus. Contrast that, this 36%, with the 12% of samples from composting farms. So we were able to find more frequently farms being contaminated if they were doing rendering, and contrasting the CTs, the number of samples that we were getting, farms that were doing rendering had far more samples being positive. If you look at these plots over here, they display the CT that we got for each of the samples. The CTs for rendering, they seem to be lower than the CTs for composting. And it is true. When we actually do statistical tests on that, we do see that. Rendering sites yielded samples yielded consistently lower CT values across sample types. So this plot over here is just, I'm disregarding the disease that we're testing. I'm just bringing here the CT according to how dead animals are being handled, stratified according to the sample type. And you can see sample types, regardless of CT for rendering sites, regardless of sample type, are consistently lower than CTs obtained from composting sites. Just goes to show, again, what I was just mentioning, right? We got more farms and more contamination on these rendering sites. Overall, carcasses and leachate samples were the ones that had lower CT values, both in composting sites over here. So if you're going to look at these two samples over here, one of them coming from leachate, another one coming from carcasses, the same thing we saw from rendering. So these two sample types, carcasses and leachate, seems to be the ones that we are finding more lower CTs, more viral contamination, regardless of how the dead animals are being processed. And we found ground samples from rendering sites that had low CT values, right? I'm specifically talking about this column over here. Could this be capturing how these animals are being brought or picked up from the dead box? And because when Rafael was visiting these farms, he was applying a questionnaire to these farms, and he was asking, okay, how are you bringing these dead animals from the barn to the dead animal handling structure? So one of the questions was, okay, how are you doing that? So well, I don't have that slide next. Maybe I mixed them up. But we investigated that, and I will bring those results soon enough. Before that, we found that for all pathogens, regardless of the pathogen, we found they were detected more frequently and on higher concentrations on the environment of rendering farms than composting farms. So over here, I'm plotting the CT values for the different sample types for different diseases, in this case PEDCOV for composting and rendering farms. So you have more samples being positive for PEDCOV in rendering than in composting sites. You have we only found PEDV positive samples in rendering farms, none in composting sites. And PERS, we found far, far more samples and lower CTs from rendering sites than from composting sites. So I was talking a little bit about some characteristics that could be associated to these results. And these results in particular, they don't change according to the criteria that we use to include the farms on this study. So I mentioned in the beginning that we were looking for farms that were either positive for PERS and PED, and then we got some farms on the rendering that they were positive for PED, and none on the farms that were doing composting. So if I go back one slide, yeah, sure, we didn't find any viruses here, but well, our inclusion criteria also made it such, or happened to be such, that composting PED positive farms were included. So this is a little bit unfair, right? So what happens when we stratify these results and we only consider the farms that were PERS positive? Essentially nothing changes. We continue to see the same trends, right? So this plot over here is similar to the previous one, but now I'm restricting the farms that are allowed to enter on this plot to be only those that are positive for PERS. So the message is still the same. We see more contamination among rendering than among composting. Essentially, the criteria of inclusion doesn't seem to have been the reason for the results that we found. PEDV was only found on the environmental farms thought to be, we found PEDV on some of these farms that when we asked them, hey, do you have PEDV? They said, no. We went over there, we sampled the environment, PED positive, and this did happen. Okay, so we decided to look and investigate a little bit about some characteristics that may be associated with this environmental contamination. And one of the things that we thought about was, well, what about the amount of rain? Maybe if it rains before we do the sampling, we're going to see perhaps the surface is being washed off, so maybe there's an effect there. Let's investigate that. So Rafael collected the precipitation data for each day for the whole week prior to each of the sampling dates that he went to the field. And we investigated that on this slide over here. And I apologize for people in the back because I realized the font size is small, but it is what it is. We did see a decrease in CT. Again, the scale is inverse for CT, right? When CT decreases, it means that we have more genetic material. So we found a decrease in CT for every inch of rain that had rained in the previous 7 days, which is a little bit paradoxical. Why would you think that? And the reason why, for every inch of precipitation, CT values obtained tend to be smaller, meaning that there seems to be more genetic material. Why? So I think that even though our expectation is that, hey, the rain would dilute the contamination, what I think that we could be capturing here is that when it rains, water from these structures drains to where we were sampling. So there might be a certain level of rain in which we would see this dilution effect, but when the rain is not too big, what we might see is that the rain actually brings pathogens that might be restricted to a certain area to a broader area. And that's when Rafael is doing the sampling. Well, now the samples come back positive. Other variables associated with environmental contamination. So we asked some of the farms, or all of the farms, if they were washing the equipment used to remove these dead animals. And this is a little bit of an unfortunate question because we had a lot of farms that actually did not reply to this question. So Rafael is actually going and not physically revisiting these farms, but he's making efforts on calling these people and, hey, I need that particular information. Because for this particular question, does the farm washes the dead removal equipment? We had 45% of the respondents of our farms, they actually did not reply or did not gave us information on that question. So, which is unfortunate. But among those that did, we had 22 farms that did give us information on that. Among the five farms that did say, hey, we do wash the dead animal removal equipment, all of these 5 farms, among these 5 farms, none of them had any positive samples. This is too small for sample size, right? And I'm not saying that, hey, if you wash your Bobcat or your Hercules machine or whatever you're using to bring the animals, you're going to get rid of environmental contamination. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that this may be capturing some sort of biosecurity effort that the farm is putting into maintaining these machines that may show up as environmental contamination in these structures. So this was the slide that I was referring before, which is associated to how the animals are being brought to the dead structure. So one of the questions was, do you drag these animals to the dead structure? And by dragging, essentially, I mean, hey, do you drop them on the ground and then you carry them either by tying a rope on their feet or somehow to these dead structures? And what this plot shows over here, it shows the proportion of samples that came back positive to any pathogen, stratified by sample type, depending on if they drag animals to the structure, yes, or if they don't drag dead animals to the structure, no. So what you can see is that the proportion of positive samples is consistently higher among farms that do drag animals to dead animal structures, right? So yeah, we have far more positive samples among carcass samples collected from farms that do drag animals to these structures than from farms that do not drag animals to these structures. The same thing goes for ground, leachate, road, and wall. So again, I don't expect the carcasses themselves to be more positive because they're dragging them on the road, but I do think that what we are capturing here is some sort of it's a proxy for biosecurity on the farm. So I think that this is what we're capturing here. Yeah, I just mentioned that. So a side note, all of the farms that said that, hey, we do drag animals to dead structures, they were actually farms that were doing rendering rather than composting. So just another side note. So some discussions and main points of this presentation. So environmental contamination around dead handling structures in wean-to-finish farms occurs. Regardless of how you handle your dead animals, you're going to see that happening. But contamination seems to be larger on farms that do rendering than in those that do composting. And I think that this is interesting. I'm not saying that this should be the reason for people to consider perhaps not doing rendering, but keep that in mind. At the end of the day, the level of biosecurity care that we have in these farms may be different, and what we may be capturing that a little bit, the amount of biosecurity effort that they put into controlling biosecurity as a whole in their farm. I do think that farm practices certainly account for some percentage of this environmental contamination, particularly when we are talking about rendering. And I have to be careful about this because it's very easy for me to end up saying, oh, you see, farms that do rendering have more contamination. Don't do rendering. I don't think that that's necessarily the way of going about it. Renderers often take the blame, but I don't think it's necessarily just them. I do believe that it's possible that renderer trucks are transporting pathogens from one farm to another because that's what they do. They drive to one farm, they pick up dead animals. They usually follow a certain route that it is risk mitigated in the sense that they try to visit only farms that are negative in a day or farms that are positive in a single day. But these processes are flawed. These trucks are not washed. It is possible that these rendering trucks are contributing to spreading the disease among these farms, but I don't think that rendering service should take all of the blame on this. If the farm drags animals on the road, it has absolutely nothing to do with the rendering process itself. It has to do with how we, as an industry, are managing this process. So I think that that's a message for us. We got to be on top of these things, because again, it's very easy to point the finger to, what's the expression? Scapegoat. And I'm not trying to save face for rendering companies, but I think it's important for us to be critics of our own work. Different surfaces of the structures, they will have different contamination levels. We kind of expected that to happen, but it's nice to see that we did find that. And biosecurity is important, and when we discuss biosecurity, we tend to think in a very strict sense. And every time that I come to the Leman conference, it seems to me that people have been willing to discuss more about biocontainment in the last few years. And I think that this is a component of biosecurity that we just don't pay enough attention. So nobody wants environmental contamination by these viruses, right? I visited farms, many farms, the vast majority of these farms, they are going to have a single access point, meaning that whenever these rendering trucks or composting is happening, oftentimes I drove by to get into the farm. So we don't want that, right? So we got to work on trying to contain these pathogens within the farms that are positive, but within these animals that are dead, that have to be removed from the farm. I think we have to do a better job of trying to keep these pathogens contained to whatever we want these pathogens to be, or where we don't care as much if these pathogens are. At the end of the day, this seems to be a numbers game. You know, if you play with fire enough times, you're going to get burned eventually. Every day, There are 1,000+ farms around us. Every single day, some of them are, the rendering truck is visiting them. Some of them are going to win the lotto, the bad lotto one day. Nobody wants that, but it will happen. There are several limitations with this project, right? Let me list a few. Limited number of farms. We only visited 40, right? That's what we got the money for. But I still think that we were able to find interesting aspects here. Data was collected. We tried to spread it out over the year, but we couldn't. So it was collected beginning in February, and I think that the last farm was collected maybe in early August. So there is some seasonal effects that I would have loved to have investigated that we couldn't. We only used transport media to preserve the samples. I think that's a justifiable decision, but one could make a point that if we had used other different medias, maybe the result would have been different. And we only visited farms with known pathogen presence. Again, this is a limitation, but this was by design. That's how the project was designed to be. We wanted to see, can we find environmental contamination around dead handling structures from positive farms? But this is not necessarily generalizable to all farms, because not all farms are positive. So this brings me to the next steps under this project and also upcoming projects. So Rafael, again, this is his project. So he's going to evaluate the effectiveness of applying a disinfectant, a lime powder, on dead handling structures. So this is happening maybe the next month or so. We were waiting on that, intentionally waiting on that, because we wanted to avoid the summer. We wanted to see the uptick in PRRS occurring for us to try this out on the field. We want to, how much more time do I have? I have 3 minutes. I won't be too long on this point. We want to apply a viral surrogate. Some of you may be familiar with GlowGerm. Essentially, it's a product that you apply and when you're doing biosecurity training of people. So you apply on a surface and then you ask people to, hey, walk around. And then you flash a UV flashlight on people later, and they're going to see the powder on people's faces, their hands, whenever they touch their hands. So it's a good tool to train people for biosecurity. We wanted to apply GlowGerm on dead boxes of one farm and trying to locate the GlowGerm on the dead boxes of a downstream farm from a rendering perspective, right? To try to address the question, is the rendering truck transporting, in this case, GlowGerm, but as a proxy for pathogens, from one farm to the other? We hit a wall on that. The rendering companies are not allowing us to do that. Hey, this is not safe for our rendering process later. And sure, it might be the case, but we are trying to figure out a way to investigate that the rendering companies would be comfortable, because I do think that that's an important investigation to be done. I presented over here the association of some variables, some variables being associated with the occurrence of environmental contamination. But Rafael will further investigate that during his master's program. So more on that in the future. Upcoming related projects. So we got some money from the Swine Disease Eradication Center to test actually different preservation medias, which I listed as a limitation on this project. So we have steps in which we're investigating that. But I also have to mention further studies that are going to also be part of Rafael's master's, associated with trying to detect environmental contamination on negative farms. And again, what I presented today was contamination around positive farms. We submitted a grant to SHIC recently, which got granted, thank you SHIC, in which we are proposing to do the same thing, but now instead of visiting positive farms, we're visiting negative farms. And the idea is somewhat similar to the GlowGerm one. If the rendering trucks are driving around and visiting these farms, well, maybe I can find some pathogen on the dead handling structure of these negative farms. And if that's the case, I think it would be an indirect way of kind of assessing the risk of transportation of pathogens from one farm to the other. Last, we have another proposal also funded by SHIC, in which we are going to install cameras for wildlife monitoring on these dead handling structures. We are interested to investigate which animals are visiting these structures. Whenever we go to these farms, people complain about every single animal that you can imagine: coyotes, eagles, raccoons, foxes, you name it, and the answer is likely yes. So this will happen also. We got funds for that. Hopefully next Leman, you're going to see some results on this. With that, I'd like once more to acknowledge Rafael. This work is his. I'm just the one doing the presentation. Other members of the group, Rafael did get 2 fellowships that are allowing him to stay here, the Bob Marison Fellowship and the Mean Drive Global Food Ventures Award. So thank you for those. Thank you once more for SCHIC. This research is a product of SCHIC funding. Thank you again. And the SDC for